I'm currently writing a book on capitalism and morality. And I thought I would just share with you the two stories of capitalism that seem to be floating around. These are stories within which you do your work. It's helpful to have them stated explicitly. So let's start with that, two stories about capitalism. So I was a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia for 16 years, and I moved to New York City just for 1 year to the Stern School of Business. I had no interest in business at the time. I had no intention to stay in a business school. But a few months after I got there, Occupy Wall Street broke out. And suddenly, issues of morality, politics, capitalism, business were extremely interesting. So it started in New York City, but quickly spread to London, to Paris, to all over the world. And gradually, well, actually fairly rapidly, the image of corporations as a giant vampire squid. There was an evocative image from an essay in Rolling Stone magazine. The image of corporations and the rich, the 1%, as bloodsuckers sucking the life out of everybody else emerged as a story. And in that environment, Thomas Piketty's book, Capital, was a celebrated bestseller, which very few people read past the first chapter. But the basic idea, well, I won't go through the basic idea, but the recommendation was much, much higher taxes are needed to rein in the otherwise runaway rising inequality. Now, there is a counter story, but it got much less play. So several people, especially libertarians, wrote books, started making a more full-throated defense of capitalism. So two particularly good books, The Bourgeois Virtues and The Rational Optimist, are book-length defenses of capitalism in the long run. And data started coming out and being more widely publicized, such as the way that capitalism raises standards of living and reduces poverty. So this is a graph of absolute poverty, what percentage of people on Earth were living in absolute poverty, that is below about $1.50 a day of 2,000 value dollars, something like that. So 95% of all people were living in extreme, absolute, grinding poverty in 1820. It drops gradually with the Industrial Revolution up to 1940. And then in the post-war world, as global capitalism spreads and Asia in particular embraces it, starts rising living standards down to 21% in 2010. And then just a couple of months ago, it was announced that as of December of last year, just 5 months ago, less than 10% of people are in extreme poverty. So this is a milestone for humanity. Less than 10% of people on Earth are living in extreme, extreme poverty. So there are these two stories out there that I began to listen to, that I began to hear as I moved to a business school. And to hear these stories being argued out, to hear the defenders and opponents of capitalism talking, it's all happening, at least in the US, against the background of rapidly rising partisan polarization. But I think once you see this, once you see that people coming from the right and the left are talking from the middle of completely incompatible stories, I think you can understand many things that I think and expect will matter to you. So implications of these stories, if you or the audience that you're speaking to, if they accept this first story, then they are perennially worried about market failures. They don't trust markets, and they expect markets to fail. They see government as a hero, as a protector, as the only force that can stand up to these predatory corporations. Government's job is to hold back the predators. Taxes are generally thought of as being too low. Taxes are a duty or social responsibility. Companies are taking services. They're expecting the government to provide all sorts of infrastructure and foundational services, and they're not paying for them, or they're not paying enough for them. Tax planning in this way of thinking is greedy, it's sneaky, it's not transparent, it's done just to evade this social responsibility, and therefore all decent people will support raising tax rates, closing loopholes, and punishing the corporations, the tax evaders, the inverters, all the people trying to get away with it. But if you embrace the second story, that capitalism is liberation, you see ubiquitous government failures. Right-wing press is always full of stories of the incompetence of government and the ways that government messes things up for the business community. So if government is the villain, it's the bully, government is holding back the business people who have a heroic spirit of innovation. We need to let them go, let them generate wealth. If you think this way, then generally you think that taxes are too high, and you use a moral framework of confiscation. Taxes are the government saying, we're just going to take this much from you. You have no say in this. We're just taking this much from you. If you think that way, then tax planning is legal, it's creative, and it's justified because taxes are confiscation. Therefore, people on the right are more likely to want lower rates, eliminating some taxes entirely, and less enforcement of tax code. So the take-home message from part one here is that when talking to any audience, when formulating policy, even when talking to your clients, you need to understand what are their implicit stories. And it'll vary from country to country. But if you know your audience and you know what story they embrace, you can be much more effective as a communicator. A really basic principle of communication is start by knowing what the other person holds sacred, what is most important to them, and then acknowledge the validity of what they hold sacred. That will instantly flag you as someone who's not just out to get them, out to fight them, but somebody who understands where they're coming from. If you do that first, then you can say a lot more and they'll be much more open to you. So always think from their point of view. What do they care about? Especially what moral issues do they hold sacred? And if you acknowledge that, you'll get much further. So that's the first part of my talk. The second part, intuitions come first, strategic reasoning second. This is what my original research was on in moral psychology. As Tim said, my first book was The Happiness Hypothesis. It was an analysis of ancient wisdom. And I collected all the sayings of the ancients about psychology, and I had a chapter on each area as to whether or not it's true. Were the ancients right? And the number one truth, the number one idea that all literate societies came up with is that the mind is divided into parts that sometimes conflict. Every society recognizes this. We have weakness of will. We're divided internally. So from Plato, we get the metaphor that the mind is like a charioteer, that's reason. We have a reasoning part, struggling to control the passions, which were, in this analogy, horses. And if a man can learn to control those horses, well, that's maturity, that's wisdom. That's the way things should be. But David Hume, my favorite philosopher, said, he challenged this. He said, no, that's wrong. He said that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. So he's turning around what Plato said. But the way to think about Hume's dictum is not that reason is a servant like this butler. It's that reason is like the press secretary of a politician. There's almost everything that goes on in our minds is automatic. We are animals, we have animal brains, we have neural networks that work by pattern matching. And that's the way brains have always worked for hundreds of millions of years. So intuition is automatic. Our intuitive automatic thinking doesn't tire out. You're just as good at facial recognition or understanding language when you're tired and drunk as when you're not. This kind of cognition is hot. That is, it's actually connected to motivation. So when automatic systems want to do something, they actually sort of can control your muscles. They can make you do things. They can make you move. That's almost everything that goes on in your mind. But sometime in the last 500,000 years, we don't know when, humans, and only humans, got this ability to think sequentially using words. We can reason. But it's a very new system. It's slow. It's effortful. If you're tired or drunk, it breaks down completely. It's cool. So you can figure out what the right thing to do is, but that doesn't mean you're going to do it, because the automatic systems are much more powerful. And it's only maybe 1%, who knows the percentage, but it's very little of what goes on in our minds. So once you see it, so the analogy that I used is that the mind, it's not a reason controlling the horses, it's a little guy on the back of an elephant. The little guy can kind of like pull the elephant's ear and try to make it go to the left, but if the elephant wants to go to the right, it's going to go to the right. And this, I think, is a more accurate analogy to what it is to be human. Now let's go to higher cognition, thinking and reasoning. And our reasoning is motivated. Our reasoning is not dispassionate. The basic principle here is that when we want to believe something, we ask ourselves, can I believe it? Do I have permission? Can I find one piece of evidence to back me up? And if so, then I can believe it. We don't say, well, is the evidence more on this side or that side? We set out to test a hypothesis, and it's, if you want to believe it, it's, is there anything to support it? Conversely, if someone tells you something you don't want to believe it, then you say, must I believe it? And if you can find one reason to discredit the claim, you can dismiss them. I don't have to think about you anymore. I'm done with you. So the take-home message from part 2 of the talk here is, whenever you're trying to persuade someone, speak to the elephant first. If the elephant is leaning towards you, if the person likes you or trusts you, then they're asking, can I believe it? And then you are likely to succeed. But if they're leaning away from you, if they don't like you, don't trust you, are in any way suspicious or angry at you, then they're asking, must I believe it? And it's almost impossible to convince somebody that they must believe something. All right, so once you see persuasion as a task of speaking first to the elephant and then to the rider, well, what do you say to the elephant? How do you appeal to moral intuitions? And this is the last part of the talk. My research over the last 10 years has been on the intuitive foundations of morality. How did we evolve as social creatures so that we find some social events right and some wrong, even when they don't implicate us, don't harm us or help us? We're always judging other people. What is that based on? And what I and my colleagues have found is that there are at least 6 innate moral foundations. You can think of them as taste buds of the moral sense. And so the first one we call care, or care and harm. Think about it like this. We are all mammals. What does it mean to be a mammal? Well, by definition, mammary glands, because we nurse our young, which means we have a very, very long childhood. We invest a lot in our children. We must be bonded with them. So this is undeniably an aspect of human nature. It's a big part of our politics. The second foundation, the most important one for you guys, is fairness versus cheating. The idea of justice, scales of balance, we all understand this. Now, on the left, fairness is used in a unique way. The left often sees inequality as unfair automatically. So the sign on the left, the 1% own 43%. Now, if you're on the left, that's an outrage. My God, it's so unequal. But people on the right will often look at that and say, well, did they create most of the wealth? I mean, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, they created stuff that's a million times more than anything I can create in my life. They deserve their money. Third foundation, liberty and oppression. So in the United States in particular, but freedom movements around the world, give me liberty or give me death is the American version of it. So in this view, you see oppressors and the oppressed, and on the left, it's corporations and the 1% are the evil psychopaths, the oppressors, the bullies, the dominators. On the right, it's more likely to be government, that is the bully, that is the oppressor, in which this sign makes sense. The fourth foundation, loyalty and betrayal. There are a number of animal species that can work together in groups, but they are almost always siblings. There's only one species that can work together in very large groups that are not kin, and that's humans. We evolved for war. We evolved for intergroup violent conflict. We are all the descendants of tribes that were more successful than the tribes they wiped out, or at least replaced by being more productive. And it's only once you understand that we evolved for war that you could possibly understand why we spend so much time and money on sports. I mean, what a waste of time if you didn't enjoy the conflict of one team against another. And since then to understand the super fandom, the craziness of the fans. So we are a tribal species. We don't have much war anymore, thank God, but we still love tribal conflict between one team and another. Fifth foundation, authority and subversion. So we are, as primates, we are hierarchical creatures. We have behavior patterns about bowing, making ourselves small, showing deference and respect. It's not that different from other primates. And the last foundation, these last two are not as important for tax inversion issues, for tax issues, but the idea of sanctity and degradation is very important around the world. This is an image, the allegory of chastity. It shows the Madonna, the Virgin Mary. Her chastity is being guarded by 2 lions with gold shields. So this is the ethos that especially is about sexuality, female sexuality, trying to keep the body as a temple. So when you are talking about economic issues, what I'm trying to say to you is no matter what you're talking about, you need to connect it to some moral foundation. Now, you can make economic arguments, and there are all kinds of economic arguments relevant to tax policy. But if you're sensitive to your company's reputation, if you're talking to the public, to the extent that you can connect what you say to a moral argument, it will be much more resonant. Economic arguments tend to fall flat. So the take-home message here, draft your messaging so that it connects to one or more moral foundations. Know how to appeal to audiences on the left and the right, particularly when you're talking to regulators, I would think. And the left and the right are different in which foundations they draw upon. That's the third and final part of the talk. So in conclusion, taxes are not just economic issues. They are and have always been moral and political issues as well. They are fought out in the court of public opinion by people who are able to press various moral buttons. And so I hope that these tools are helpful and useful to you as you have your discussions and your deliberations over the next 2 days. Thank you very much.